Hey everyone, it's that math magician, and on this video, we're going to take a look at the equation of a line in its generic form, which is y equals mx plus b. And hopefully, at the end of this video, you'll have a deep understanding of what each term or variable means in this equation. So let's get started. I've gone ahead and color-coded this equation just so we're able to see how each of those terms are going to affect our equation. Now hopefully we can recall from our function machines that y here is just the outputs for this equation and that x here is the input. And remember from our function machine that x and y, those numbers varied because we could put any number in for the input and we wanted to see what the output would be. So we call x and y, we call those variables. We call them variables because they vary. Those numbers are always changing. We're always dropping in a new input to see what our output is. So those are variables. Now we have two new letters that we want to define, and we want to make sure that we understand what m and what b both do to this equation. Now we have been looking at our tile patterns for a while, and with our tile patterns we talked about m, and we mentioned that m was talking about the growth of those tile patterns. Now we have started to learn that there is a more technical term that we want to use besides just growth, and that technical term that I'll put in parentheses is called slope. And slope is sort of referring to the steepness of the graph. How quickly is the graph of the line growing for this equation? And we determined that slope was delta y over delta x. Really, it's the change of y over the change of x. And we'll look at that in a second. But I wanted just to make sure that we understood that m here represents the growth of the line, but in the more technical sense, we're going to start calling that the slope of the line. The other term we need to talk about is this b term at the end. And when we're referring to tile patterns, we actually have been talking about that as being figure 0. How many tiles did figure 0 have? But in terms of the graph now, right, we're looking at graphs. We're not dealing with these tile patterns anymore. Really, we started to learn that the tile pattern for B really is what we see on the graph as the Y-intercept. And that's what we're going to call this from now on. Okay, the B term at the end of the equation is the Y-intercept. It's where the graph crosses the y-axis. Now m and b are not what you would call variables because their values don't vary. These are what we call parameters. And they're the parameters that sort of define this equation and dictate what happens to the input to get the output. Okay, again, think back to those function machines. We're dropping our input in. That input is always changing. But m and b are constant. They're not changing. Those are numbers that will not change when we're dealing with the equation of a line. So let's go ahead and look at one graph for a line and see if we could figure out its equation. So I'm going to scroll down here. I have some graph paper here that we can use to graph this line. I'm going to zoom out so we can still see all that information perfect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out an equation and see if we can figure out the graph for that line. So let's say that the graph started here at positive 2, and then let's say that the next point was over here at 3, 4. Let me get my ruler so we can draw this line. And then we want to see, can we find the equation for this line? Don't forget to put arrows at the end of your graph when you're graphing. Now, looking at this line, we want to see, can we figure out what our m and our b terms are? Again, we're trying to figure out what's the slope, what's the y-intercept. So when dealing with the equation, we'll always have y equals mx plus b. And the y and the x are always going to be there. They're not going to change because those are the values that are constantly being moved. It's our job when looking at this graph to figure out the slope, to figure out the y-intercept. Well, I always start with the y-intercept because that tends to be the easiest. Remember, this is our y-axis here. I'm looking at this line. To figure out what my b term is, I just have to find out where does this line intersect the y-axis. And it intersects right here where my orange dot is already at a value of 2. So the y-intercept here is at 0, 2. Since 2 is the output, that is what our b term is. That's where it crosses the y-axis. Had this line crossed it down here at -4, well then I would not have written a 2. Instead I would have written a -4, but that's not what our graph did. Now for the next step, I'm going to zoom in here so we can see. We define slope as delta y over delta x. Remember that this Greek letter delta just stands for change. So I'm looking at the change of y over the change of x. So looking at this first point here and this second point over here, what we want to do to figure out the slope is we actually want to draw in what we call a slope triangle. And what a slope triangle does is it helps us identify what that slope is. So looking from this orange point to this green point, I see that this right side here of my triangle represents my delta y. It represents my change in y. And this change in y is a value of +2. +2 because I'm increasing, I'm going up. Now over here with my delta x, I see that my delta x here has a value of 1, 2, 3. It is gaining 3 units to the right, so we're going to say that our delta x here is 3. Okay? So when I'm developing my slope here, the slope will always be a fraction of your delta y over your delta x. Well, my delta y here has a value of 2, +2, and a value of 3 on the bottom. And that is the equation for this line. And we can see that the equation for this line tells us that the y-intercept is at 2, and then to get to the next point, our slope says that we just need to go up 2 over 3, we're at the next point. And this process will repeat. Up 2 over 3, there's the next point. That will continue to go on as this line goes on forever. I hope that this was a great way of kind of showing you guys all the different terms in the equation of a line, and hopefully we can start to understand that this m term stands for slope and that the b term stands for y-intercept, and how we can find those from a graph. Alright guys, it's that math magician, and I'll see you on the next video.